Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Adam Berger. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at Netrix and also our VP over our Managed Services Security offerings. Today, we are here to host the second part of our series for a cybersecurity roundtable on the emerging security threat of a multi-factor authentication bypass, also known as MFA bypass. This technique is now widely used by threat actors and is effectively disarming traditional MFA security practices. We've seen a huge surge in the last year in our security teams across our clients and many of our accounts where this technique is being used to gain access to client infrastructure, internal accounts being used to gain environment access. And we're seeing enough of this in addition to some of our major providers like Cisco and Microsoft who are releasing articles highlighting that they're also seeing this threat. We wanted to have this roundtable to kind of walk through what this attack technique is. Give a little bit of detail of how you can put some prevention in place and what kind of strategies you can deploy to protect your organization from this threat. And to help highlight the threat itself and get into what protections are available to deploy into your infrastructure, we have two excellent SMEs here with us. So I want to introduce them, and then we'll kind of hop in. First, we have Rich Lilly. He's a technologist and a field CTO at Netrix for security. Rich brings over 25 years of consulting experience. He is also our leading SME in Microsoft security, compliance, and identity here at Netrix. And followed up with that is also Chris Clark, who is the manager of our Microsoft security team. Chris brings over 20 years of consulting experience, and he's been specializing Microsoft security for over a decade. So welcome, guys. Happy to have you on the call. Before we hop into actually, talking about MFA bypass and how we can protect ourselves from it, Rich is actually going to walk us through a little bit of a demonstration of the technique itself, which should highlight kind of why it's concerning and how threat actors are actually using it. So I'm going to kick it over to Rich.
Yeah, just to kind of set the stage, appreciate it, Adam. I think a lot of folks have heard about this. Our goal here is to show a bit of that to you today. So many folks have heard of the Evil Genix type attack before. And this attack is very common. It's probably one of the most easy to get and also the easiest to recreate out there today. So what we want to take you through for about the next 1 to 2 minutes here is a quick demonstration of what this looks like. And then we'll talk exactly about how that was done, as well as some ways to remediate it, and then why some of the common effective controls today are not able to stop that either. So let's go ahead and start the video. Pretty interesting attack.
Yeah, thanks for highlighting that, Rich. So, Rich, can you walk us through a little bit, just like what we saw there, and what are the concerns highlighted when you look at that attack vector as far as how that is executed and how somebody gets to an account?
Yeah, I think, for me, I think what I loved is that first slide kind of explaining the attack for those that aren't familiar with what an MFA bypass attack is. I think one of the challenges we face right now is that for past 10 years, many folks have been thinking about and finally getting their users to agree for them to roll out multi-factor authentication. And one of the tough things is showing you right there that even with multi-factor authentication enabled and enforced, that you can't stop this type of attack because of the type of token theft that's actually happening in it. So, we're not saying that MFA isn't effective, but it can be made ineffective through ways like this, and that does necessitate more modern ways to accommodate, security in today's world than with MFA and we did in the past. So, it's very interesting to see that and how easy it is. Kudos to Alex Shee from our OffSec team for putting that video together. This is pretty easy to research, and it's something that is pretty oftenly seen out there in most of our clients today as well, unfortunately.
Walk us through the second part of that, Rich. So what we saw there is typical email, right? So how is how's a threat actor getting this to somebody and then able to use, the creds to actually steal a session?
Yeah, I mean, listen, the ingress points can be multiple different ways. I think the most common that I see is still sending phishing emails because people just still have a propensity to click on things that may appear to be real or they're unsure of what they are. So it's definitely the highest probability one that we're being sent out. I won't also diminish the fact that these things are coming in through SMS, mimicking, say, a service desk or a help desk or your manager or leadership team. We're also seeing it's on the rise right now is Teams messages. And this could be, where you have open communication with outside parties. This could also be done through QR codes, scanning in a bus station or something as well. A little bit less common, but there's so many different pathways. The core point though is to try to serve people up with whatever this false, link is that you saw generated. But definitely the highest probability one is most likely going to be email these days.
Yeah, and effectively, once a user puts their creds in, they are able to just steal the session, right? So once the session is stolen, they effectively could impersonate the user, right? And at that point, Rich, I assume, they essentially have unfettered access to the account. I mean, I think you've seen you and Chris both in some compromised scenarios where, somebody gets that access and then they're able to do things. You kind of want to walk us through what you've seen, like post kind of incident scenario after an account is compromised.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll even say, like you mentioned, user password, but we're talking user password MFA challenge. So, really,
Yeah.
two additional important mechanisms there for 2FA. So, yeah, I mean, so again, once that token is stolen in that scenario, that session, as long as that session lifetime is good, becomes usable by that attacker. Session lifetimes will vary for the most part, but even for any time greater than 0, I would consider that something bad. From there, that session can be used to impersonate a user. That can be used for things like lateral movement. So now that I can act as that user and get into their mailbox, I could reach out to other folks in my team or that person's team, excuse me, reach out to their manager. I could reach out to their leadership teams. I could, I am someone. I mean, basically anything you could do to impersonate the user or socially engineer the company can be done on that user's behalf at this point. So, the reality is, whatever that user has access to, whatever that user may be able to communicate with, is all something that's going to be exposed at that point. And again, the 0-day attack, the person, the victim, who's always a 0-day victim, excuse me, they're not always the ones that you're always after. So a lot of these are techniques just to be able to get to whatever that next step is, to get to the crown jewels, credentials, etc. And these things are detectable, but it's certainly something that is not easy to stop these days. But we will talk about some methods around that in just a little bit as well.
Yeah, good call out in terms of just what they can get access to, and that, like you said, typically it's a multi-stage technique: get in and then land and expand. Generally speaking, how sophisticated are the threat actors? Do they need to be to actually deploy this technique, Rich, from what you've seen?
Not very sophisticated is the unfortunate answer. This is, as you saw in the video, we're talking, handful of lines of code to generate what you really need to, and then it's really the social engineering process. So I won't necessarily say, a script kiddie, because I think that's kind of a term of the past at this point, but there's not a lot of advanced technique that is being used here because the method has already been well developed and well packaged in tools like Evil GNX and even some others. So unfortunately, it's not very sophisticated. It doesn't have to be a sophisticated person in order to execute on this attack.
Yeah, definitely concerning. So you laid a good foundation here, Rich, for raising the concern, right? So we have easy deploy technique, right? Used through conventional social engineering tactics, and the ability to gain direct access to account and bypass MFA, which we've all been kind of told is the silver bullet, as you highlighted. So definitely highlights why we wanted to have this discussion and focus on how can people protect themselves, right? That's like the big piece here, and that does take a strategy, right? So let's hop into protection or potential strategies, right? So there are some tactical ways. I think we'll get into that, but there is definitely a trend in the industry moving towards like a passwordless strategy, right? So relying less on conventional passwords, a little more on additional authentication mechanisms. So Rich, you want to lay a little bit of foundation on just kind of what is a passwordless strategy? How does that maybe help in this scenario? And then we'll kick it over to Chris to get into some technical details.
Yeah, for sure. So passwordless strategies are just what they sound like. They're scenarios in which passwords either A, don't exist, or B, are not known by a user, usually randomly generated characters that are generated by a tool stored nowhere and known by no one. And these are more for placeholder properties where a password needs to exist for some technical function. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean the password always has to be used. And Chris will talk about some of the technologies in which that becomes relevant here. In many cases, what we see kind of the modern path of this is going through and, again, going through some point in time, revolving users' passwords to something random from what they are today. It does require some other solutions to be in place. This always isn't as easy as it sounds. We may make it sound easy, but in many cases, there may be some legacy applications or services or apps that may be on a user's desktop that just don't support these modern type of credentials. So one of the opportunities to start is at least reducing the user visible password surface. So what I mean by this is like how often and the user having to enter their credentials when they go to a prompt like you saw earlier. Again, we'll talk about some techniques to do that, but that's usually kind of step number one because it's not always realistic just to eliminate all passwords. The other option is to move to a passwordless deployment. There are options from Microsoft and other vendors to not have to have users use passwords. And again, Chris will talk about some of these in a few minutes. And the kind of final step or the North Star kind of finish line for most is actually eliminating passwords from the identity directory. This isn't supported in all scenarios, and certainly not for all accounts. I'll highlight that like not all accounts are created equal. This is way easier from a user account perspective, or instead of say maybe a service account or other type of like purpose-built single-use accounts. But at least from a user perspective, this tends to be the first thing that can become a reality. And unfortunately, there's not a way today in like Active Directory just to not have a password, so it still has to be set to something. But in some of the more modern efforts, even if that can be reset to something random that no one knows, is effectively contributing to getting to that passwordless state. So these are kind of the big steps we see. And again, it's not quick and easy for all, but certainly to start taking some of those steps now is definitely critical given some of the attacks we're seeing out there.
Awesome. Yeah. I think, Rich, what you're highlighting here is just, a few different ways to skin the proverbial cat, right, when it comes to how you are deploying a strategy behind this. And Chris, you do a lot of different engagements with our clients on the Microsoft front, and there are a bunch of ways, as Rich is highlighting. So can you kind of walk us through some of the common techniques that would fall under either a passwordless strategy or account protection strategies that would help kind of combat MFA bypass or put protections in place that help you, build a layered strategy around authentication?
Yeah, definitely. It's really a hot topic almost on a daily basis. So the conversations that we're having with our clients on my team. So one of the key areas, as Rich started to get into, is kind of developing that passwordless strategy, which also really relates to phishing resistant strategy as well. So they can go kind of hand in hand, and I'll try and point out some of the differences there, but not necessarily all passwordless technology is actually phishing resistant in the Microsoft 365 ecosystem. So an example of that is Microsoft Authenticator, which we saw in the sample attack, is using number matching, and that's on by default, right? So that was a push by Microsoft to even get that in place, and now we can see how easily that was bypassed, right, with that simple tool. So very alarming, but good news is there is an approach, and kind of what Rich was mentioning. One of the first things to do is develop, what that replacement option is for to get to passwordless or to get to phishing resistant. So in Enter ID, there's a couple main methods. There's Windows Hello for Business. There's FIDO2 keys, and also passkey and authenticator. These are both considered passkey if you look at kind of the overall term in the Microsoft documentation. So FIDO2 keys and passkey and authenticator, which is a newer capability, almost like a FIDO2 key on your iOS or Android device using Microsoft Authenticator, are passwordless and phishing resistant methods. And then certificate auth is another one. So there are kind of direct methods that your users will need to register for, or you'll have to have those other components in place. So an example of that would be like certificate auth involving PKI, having that in place, having certificates deployed to devices. So kind of like what we were alluding to, it's easy to kind of talk about and understand the concepts, but bringing it into adoption, right, involves a lot of different teams, a lot of different areas, including user adoption at the same time, which we'll stress throughout the conversation here. So really understanding kind of what those password replacement options are, how you can basically test and scope those with what's called authentication policies in Enter ID. That allows you to easily use test users, use a small POC pilot group, right? You're not impacting the larger user base as you start to understand what's involved with devices, right? How do these FIDO2 keys, as an example, work with Windows, work with Mac OS, work with iOS and Android? So there's lots of nuances there that need to be kind of discovered, right? And help you determine what those password replacement options are and the phishing resistant methods are. So one of the other areas mentioned was kind of reducing the visible passwordless surface area that Rich mentioned. And ultimately, that is looking at applications. How can you modernize applications and get them into Enter ID so you can take advantage of these authentication methods? So the more apps you can modernize, kind of understanding the types of personas that you have in your environment, right? You have knowledge workers, you have frontline workers, you have consultants and vendors that you work with. Each one might have some unique or different types of requirements that you have to work through, right, to get them to these types of solutions. So ultimately, it does have a large user adoption aspect to it, right, that needs to be brought into planning. Even something when you're rolling this out, looking at, communications of like T-minus communications to get users to register for these methods, tracking that registration, monitoring help desk tickets, kind of understanding the impact there. And ultimately, what you're trying to get to is the ability to have these users up and running with these methods so you can enforce, say, a phishing resistant policy with something like conditional access. So that kind of closes the gate, right? It's great to deploy all these items, but if you don't have some enforcement method to make users actually use them and enforce it in various areas that we'll go through, then you're not quite there to that final state. So also, as Rich mentioned, eliminating passwords overall. So we work with a lot of clients recently that are divesting from another larger company or have their sights set on just going to Enter ID completely. So you can have Enter ID joined devices. You can have all your cloud applications configured with SSO and Enter ID, and that sets you up with kind of the perfect runway to look exactly what we're talking about. So can I transition to something like autopilot with Windows 10 or Windows 11? Can I switch to passwordless? Can I now enforce phishing resistant methods? So that is a great way to kind of understand, what's possible from that side. But then if you're the traditional hybrid environment with Active Directory still, we kind of look at what Rich was saying is you get to the point where you can randomize the Active Directory password, right? It could be, you could use a script to randomize, the AD password to 64 characters that no one's ever going to breach, right? Or the user will never know from that point. So there's other techniques to onboarding users into the newer methods. One of those is called a temporary access pass and Entra ID, and that actually allows you to get a time-bound temporary access pass to get in to register your method. So there's this kind of not even futuristic, but it's real. It's happening now with multiple clients that we're working with. But you could be sent, a Windows laptop. You can sign in the out-of-box experience with the temporary access pass, and be able to register a FIDO2 key, right? Or be able to register passkey and authenticator as that option. Or maybe you already have certificates that are deployed through Intune to that count for authentication. So it really opens up thinking through even your onboarding process that might be impacted with really addressing the MFA bypass, the man-in-the-middle attacks here. So.
Chris, a lot of what you said around the user adoption reminds me of when MFA itself was first rolling out, right? So would you, in terms of just having to work with users, rollout plans, would you say if you are approaching one of these strategies, just getting that rolled out through your user base and effectively enforced, like that's the biggest part of a engagement to get this executed on and get a strategy in place?
Yeah, that's definitely a large part. There's still the technical aspect of how it really works in the real world, right? That we're having constant conversations with clients about. So an example would be if you have a FIDO2 key and you have, your iOS, Android device, your phone or your iPad or tablet, whatever it may be, you have an NFC version of that FIDO2 key that can actually authenticate with those devices. So you start to think about your device ecosystem, generally looking at Windows, Mac OS, iOS, Android, Linux, maybe even outside of that. Virtualization, right? So if you have, Windows 365, you have Azure Virtual Desktop, Citrix, whatever it may be, you really need to see exactly what everyone's logging in with, the type of applications they're using, and understand and plan that. But as you alluded to, getting users to register those methods is key, right, at that point. So there are some automated ways to say bulk register like FIDO2 keys. Soon enough, they might be more available like in the Entra ID portal, but there are ways to script it essentially now. And it's really having those communication platform, T- type of communications to let your users know that they have, this window to register their device. There's workbooks and reporting and Entra ID that allows you to track that effectively, to know when you can actually enforce the policies that do block these types of attacks. So.
It's a good call out, Chris. Yeah, I think kind of highlighting what you said earlier is, there's many doors into your environment, right? So, Chris, you're definitely highlighting the importance of understanding all the avenues that somebody can get into an account, right, and making sure that these these mechanisms are deployed. Because if not, then that's sort of a backdoor at that point, right? Like you've got to do enforcement kind of across the board. What from your consulting engagements your team is doing, Chris? What's like the most common use of a third layer of authentication that's in this territories that you're seeing deployed more often than others in the client sites?
Yeah, I think overall, I mean, it's kind of interesting, but it's a fairly new topic, right? That we're finding. It's very surprising. What was mentioned is kind of the traditional MFA rollout, which we've done for years, right? Going back, 5+ years, right? If we think about it that way. A lot of organizations have conditional access in place. They have MFA in place, right? We're working with organizations to even do conditional access rebaselining, right? And that involves exactly what we're talking about. So the first step that we're seeing is really looking at these methods for administrators right away, right? So we want to target admin roles and Entra ID privilege roles and get them on phishing resistant methods and passwordless methods as soon as possible. it helps you kind of stress test, sample user group, right, which would be the administrators, and really helps you develop that strategy to then get to the regular users. So once you've at least gone through, I'd say, the administrative side of things, you start to look at those personas again, right? So are there users that are just using, Entra ID autopilot devices? Are there users that are more reliant on on-premises applications? Each one of those questions will really determine what route you can go and how fast you can go with those users. So it's kind of like a stage process, I'd say, that we've found so far, and finding what are the best methods to adopt, right? Like FIDO2 has an expense to it. You have to buy a FIDO2 key like YubiKey or Fission or others that are fully supported. Something like Passkey and Authenticator is actually free, right? You just need a mobile device. But then you have frontline workers that can't use a mobile device. So it's an interesting set of conversations, but involves a lot of planning. But it is definitely doable that we're seeing, right? But you have to go in careful steps, right?
That makes sense. So, understand your technology environment a bit, look at the ways you can deploy the technology effectively, and then look at your layers of users. As you're highlighting, Chris, kind of understand admins as an example, probably you want to go some increased security there, maybe a little more interruptive, whereas your average user, you are looking at like adoption versus the method that's deployed, right? If it's too hard, then you may have problems, service desk issues, or they don't adopt, right? Or you have issues getting the rollout in.
Right.
That's a kind of a key highlight here, I would say. So we are talking about the user a fair amount, right? As far as who is the person that's going to be putting these credentials in and who we're trying to protect here, obviously. So, we look at, we talked a little bit here, Chris educated us on kind of the various protection mechanisms. Let's talk briefly about user education, right? So, MFA bypass is definitely, on the rise. How do we, when we look at like our awareness and training programs, I'll kind of kick this over to Rich. Like, is there anything specific that we should be highlighting around this technique that differs from existing training?
I would double down on the existing, kind of traditional social engineering phases that you're seeing today. As we talked about in the early part of the webinar, coming in through links, still going to be super common. Links and email, excuse me, are still going to be super common. I would maybe expand that circle a little bit to things like I said earlier, like Teams messages, SMS, kind of like non-traditional methods, because they are really coming from everywhere these days. So, I think the more you can educate your users on that, to how to be how to be aware of emails that are not coming from verified or trusted sources, how to be aware to do hover over on links and check for the links. These are things that are probably never going to change. Some users, unfortunately, will never learn. So continuing to keep on doing more and more of those, I think, and just covering the different mediums, I think, are the best thing that we can all do right now until we can get to a world of everyone using phishing-resistant MFA methods.
Good highlight. Chris, as far as clients that we're doing engagements with, are you seeing any additional training tactics deployed, or maybe when we're rolling out these kind of strategies at companies, they're doing some user training tied to that? Anything that you're seeing with our client base?
I think it's kind of like it's program management around the whole aspect of trying to increase security, right? Reduce exposure. So kind of letting the user understand that they can be part of that is kind of what kind of like a program description, right? That leads everything and helps people champion it. And then really it's if you look at the different registration methods for the types of phishing resistant methods that we discussed, each one has a different step to it. So you want to have clear and concise, user guides for those and give them enough time to register those methods while also tracking it and helping them move along in the process, right? So you can get it enforced. So very, the key would be very clear and concise communications, right? That help the user adopt those new technologies.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, I think Rich, what you highlighted there too around social engineering, the techniques are kind of no different than they have been deployed. They're just using this new method to sort of weaponize that further, which does highlight some of the protections that Chris went through, and getting adoption for some of these new methods really becomes more of the focus. I think traditional training programs still lay a good foundation, but yeah, as you alluded, Rich, users will be users, so to speak. Speaking like a security admin, that's kind of just, you've got to, in addition to educating, look at these protections. So um, awesome. So we talked about protection and got into a little bit of prevention through user education. Let's talk about like detection for a little bit here. Rich, what kind of monitoring or alerting capabilities are out there to potentially see when an MFA bypass is being deployed, or maybe telemetry that you could look at that might make you aware that this technique is being used in your infrastructure?
Yeah, there are a couple of things built into both Entra as well as tools like Sentinel and Defender XDR for suspected token theft. You can never be 100% sure all the time, but there are indicators that potentially may look at the reuse of a token from a from an odd perspective that may indicate something that's bad. So I would say there's things built into Entra ID and even conditional access. There's some anomalous token usage CA policies you can enable. There's also, they said in Sentinel, the anomalous token usage detections there as well. These should certainly be reviewed and supplemented. Again, we're finding in many cases that a lot of our clients and just folks out in the world are experiencing these attacks, and most of the time they don't know about them until it's too late, and they're having to go back and retroactively, recover and see how it was done, etc. So nothing's perfect, I'll say these days, but there's definitely ways and tools within both what you own and say the Microsoft platform and others to be able to do some of the detection.
Uh, kind of thinking through what it looks like on the client side, Chris, where your team has actually helped put a lot of these detections in place for clients in like Microsoft infrastructure. How are you seeing some detections that are related to either Defender or risky logins or some of these policies? Like how effective have they been for our clients, and kind of how does that, when effective, actually shut things down for this bypass technique that we're seeing?
Yeah, to kind of help answer that, to add some more detail kind of around enforcing the phishing resistant scenario, there's what's called authentication strength in Entra ID, and you can set that authentication strength as a requirement to be the authentication strength in conditional access, or even something like privileged identity management. So I can say that these groups of users have to use phishing resistant methods. So there are other methods actually that are in conditional access. There's token protection that's in preview. It has some limitations. It's only targeted at Windows and Windows Server, right? But it is getting there, right? So it's as iterations probably go on, it's going to apply to more platforms. It's another avenue to help stop it, in the beginning. But like you mentioned, there's risk-based signals throughout Entra ID and just Defender XDR overall. So we also create user risk and sign-in risk policies in conditional access as our suggested baseline. And you can have something as an example of a high user risk scenario to block the user, or maybe force a password reset. Maybe there's additional automation that can come in, like revoking the token, right? We work with our own SOC or just Sentinel in general as an example. We can run automations to revoke the token, disable the user, right? Go above and beyond some of the automations that are built into Entra ID. So you have a lot of those capabilities, but one other item that's kind of overlooked is, what Rich mentioned. We can't stop everything, right? Something's going to get through, but there's other signals, right? And that's where we get to like a defense in depth scenario. So why is an attacker there? They're usually there. Ransomware is common, but more so exfiltration of data. So now you have other signals from, say, something like Purview, where you're picking those up. Those are also feeding in the Defender XDR. And now, even though something got by, you have a second chance, right, to say, all right, there's all these insider risk signals going on. Now we have a problem. Now let's launch automation, et cetera. So there's all these different layers of an attack that need to be taken into account, right? Which ultimately goes into the response.
Makes sense. So, try to protect the account in the first place by putting one of these techniques in place. Ultimately, they may get through, right? Then you look at, okay, is the account itself doing anything odd, right? Signing in from different location or a risk profile based thing. And then beyond that, what other anomalous activity may they be doing, right? Like, opening a bunch of emails, sending a bunch of outbound email, different signals in the environment. So it sounds like few ways to detect at least and pick up on this kind of. I like you highlighted, Chris, or defense in depth, right? Because you effectively can't prevent all the attacks. So having those additional detection mechanisms in place and looking for anomalous behavior is another way to sort of just build out a strategy around trying to get in front of this specific threat.
Definitely.
So that was a little bit of detection there, right? So we're looking, obviously things are getting through. How do we detect? So and to follow that through furthermore, right? If something does happen, Rich, you kind of mentioned, one of the things we do see is people, will get into the accounts for a period of time, and then they're there maybe for a little while, right? And so when we're talking about responding to this happening, where you maybe got missed, you now detect that you find out somebody was in the account. What type of incident response tactics, Rich, do you suggest that we're seeing with our clients when it comes to recovering from this kind of compromise?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it depends on if it's day 0 or day 50, right? And hopefully it's closer to day 0 than anything past day 1. But number 1 is always going to be starting with account isolation. When I say isolation of an account, that can mean a multitude of things. That could be resetting the password, revoking the session tokens. That could be removing all the MFA methods, even maybe not allowing the user to log in for a specific period of time until some investigatory process can be completed. The account compromise, the account isolation as a result of a compromise is always step number 1. The other thing we always recommend looking at as well, depending on the context of the account exposure, is also potentially looking at device isolation. Again, isolating a device that may not be a part of the actual incident may not be effective, but depending on specific scenarios and maybe a remote access Trojan or something on the device, this may need to be considered. And these days, devices aren't just the physical asset that the user has. It could also be their VDI session in Citrix or Windows 365 or AVD. It could be other platforms. So there are other factors in here that means that the device could be everything from their mobile device to a virtual device to their PC based device. Also, Chris touched on this a little bit, but post breach detection for defense in depth, like getting the logs out of key tools like Entra, Office 365, your endpoint telemetry, whether it be your EDR platform or your endpoint DLP platform, having some type of forensic view of what happened during this course of time is always important. If that's still ongoing, then you need to collect the logs all the way back to when that time was. But all of those will play an important role in it as well. And then one thing that's becoming more and more important, I would say especially more over probably the last 6 to 12 months, is a lot of folks are focused more now on kind of the data security side. So, actually investigating what is the potential impact of data loss as well. Was there, as Chris mentioned earlier, was there content that was exfilled? What was in that content? How was it labeled? What's the risk to the business that content is exposed? Is just as important as access these days. So something we definitely are seeing a rise in. And then finally, we're kind of at the account recovery phase. All these things kind of have to happen first for the most part. And then account recovery can again be circling back on some options Chris gave earlier today. If you've got like a temporary admin pass or access pass in place today, go out, issue that to your user, make sure they're registering in an authorized method, make sure they're obviously registering in a phishing resistant method as well. And then going through the rest of the checklist as far as getting their device back online, making sure their accounts persist access and things like that. You may even consider some post investigation account monitoring as well for any other factors or pieces that may still be in there as well. But all these play an important role. It just depends on where you are in the process, but definitely important to cover the bases across the board.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. One thing to call back to what we mentioned earlier in the call, not only what data was exfilled potentially, but if the threat actor may be in the infrastructure looking to crawl around, get access to other accounts through this technique, they may have sent emails on behalf, and then Chris highlighted that, right? So kind of understanding what was done even beyond maybe exfiltrating data. Could look for maybe the attack was targeted at another person from one of your own internal accounts, and kind of looking at those angles too. So not just focus on the user. Chris and Rich, you guys have both highlighted that, of just really understanding what was happening, because not only could have been your data, but they could be creeping around and trying to get somewhere else. So having a good recovery strategy. Rich, you kind of highlighted like end to end, even though maybe doing a few of these extra things may be overkill, like isolating a device. Better safe than sorry, Rich, is kind of what I'm hearing from you.
Yeah, and I like that you highlighted the internal phishing example, because we have seen that in years past. I mean, it kind of spreads the same way ransomware does, right? All you need is patient 0, and the rest of it from there. A lot of folks don't put as rigid of a security on their internal communications via emails, or even, we've talked a couple times about Teams today as well. So that's kind of like loosely considered to be trusted if it's coming in from a known entity. I know it's coming from Jane or John Doe in these scenarios, but because it has my email address, it's kind of trusted in that sense. Being able to look at and understand and even train the users on this scenario, and there's even now technologies in place to help detect some of these scenarios as well, is important, because it's something we are seeing out there in the wild as well. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Okay, so with that, we're going to close out the webinar today. Hopefully today everybody learned kind of how real this threat is. We walked through sort of how easy it was to actually execute the attack. Rich kind of helping us highlight a password strategy, something organizations, passwordless strategy, something organizations should be looking at. Chris actually helped us really sort of highlight what those various protection mechanisms, and then beyond protection, what things do you need to think about as an organization for detection and response. We covered a whole bunch of different technologies that can be deployed. So as an artifact for the closure of this, in the actual notes in the webinar, we will make sure we provide some of the links to some of the methods that can be deployed here, and some of the detections and some of the recommended response techniques as an artifact. And hopefully everybody found this informative and has been educated and can take a look at their own risk internally, and can take some protections to protect their organization from this attack vector. Thank you, and have a great day.
Thanks.